Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Avorion episode 23. I'm Enigmius and today we are continuing with the Samson build. It's just getting bigger and bigger. No matter what we do, that's the only constant in this build is that it keeps getting bigger. I wanted to start off, I mentioned in the last episode, I wanted to start off by getting some of these critical systems in place. Generators, energy storage containers, cargo containers, crew quarters, engines, see some engines going into place, all this stuff that you really need in order to make a ship work. There may be some things that you put in later that are kind of subjective based on what you were trying to accomplish, but I can't imagine the ship without these sort of key systems. We've got also directional thrusters, gyros, inertial dampeners. Those are all sort of in that category of conditional additions. I've actually done a little bit of testing with directional thrusters and thrusters placed in the nacelles of the ship, those two cylindrical things that are off to either side, and they're pretty much useless. It's the only way I can think of to describe them. In terms of what you get out of them for the size that they take, you know, for the amount of space that they take up, I felt like I was wasting the space. I can get better performance out of a collection of gyros that are each set to operate on a different plane than I can out of, the equivalent amount of space in directional thrusters. And I think it's related to the overall mass of the ship. I don't know for sure. I just know that looking at the key maneuverability characteristics, pitch, yaw, roll, as well as just sort of general, thrust. You're not necessarily looking for thrust out of thrusters, ironically, but just kind of looking at the big picture in terms of the mass, the amount of energy they use, and what they contribute to the maneuverability of the ship. I was getting more out of gyros is the bottom line, and then throwing in inertial dampeners to handle the braking thrust, as opposed to what I was originally led to believe for the thrusters and directional thrusters, that they would be also able to contribute significantly to the braking thrust. My experience is they haven't been. What I probably am going to test at some point in the future is just making a wee little tiny ship, like a fighter, something that I would consider a fighter size, and equipping it with the thrusters and directional thrusters, and see if that actually works on something that's just tiny, as opposed to the stuff that I've been building, which maybe kind of started at a small medium kind of size, and now we're sort of pushing our way up into the larger size ships, which was something else I wanted to bring up just while we're filling in. I'm basically just kind of jamming stuff in. I wish I could tell you that there was a pattern, or that there was a system that I was using to determine what goes into what hole, but it's not that clear. I'm just sort of putting stuff in place, and then you can see we put in some armor blocks to fill in the holes that we wouldn't want to waste time trying to jam critical systems into. And it continues that way all the way around until the ship is nearly full. The nacelles at this point in time, as the ship sits, we still have some room in the nacelles that we can work with. But realistically speaking, we've got the main body of the ship at this point filled up, filled in, and ready to go. I realized as I was placing some of these components, the cost of each one is quite a bit more than I'd anticipated, because the way that I set it up, with especially the main sort of hull of the ship, I could place an extremely large component that basically ran from one end to the other as one block. And there was at one point placing something in the lower section of the main hull area. It wasn't even very wide, but it ran from one end to the other, and it was worth over 100,000 credits plus material necessary to make it. So this is not going to be necessarily the kind of ship that you would have as your third ship. coming from a fresh start and gathering all of the materials and coming up with the credits on your own, I don't think that it would be very reasonable to come up with the kind of resources that you need to build a ship like this. I'm interested now to see what the final total is going to be in terms of everything that's required. You see here, we're stacking gyros. Basically, that's what the maneuverability of this ship is coming from, is stacking gyros. And we've got 3 different stacks at this point. And like I say, each stack is one plane. So you'll have one on the X plane, one on the Y plane, one on the Z plane. And that sort of gives you all of the maneuverability you're going to get out of something that size. I think the ship is going to be okay. I haven't had a chance to test it with crew on board yet, but from what I've been able to see with no crew at all, just looking at the numbers, it's going to be kind of slow, but it's going to stop in about 2.5 seconds from top speed to 0. So we're doing at least one thing right in this entire build, but we'll find out more when we get the crew on board. The crew requirement is also nearing 1,000 crew, which is quite a dramatic jump from the Malapis, which had, I think, at a maximum 58 crew that we could carry, and that was more than we needed to fill every spot on the roster for mechanics, engineers, gunners, miners, etc. So this one is much, much larger. It's got, I'm hoping, a relatively considerable amount of cargo storage for the amount of space that it's taking up. The cargo containers that we put on board, I think we have just over 3,000 cubic meters of cargo storage. But I have no frame of reference in terms of how good that may or may not be. And the only way to find out is to pass through a debris swarm left by a hapless cargo carrier that was attacked by pirates or aliens, and see if we can pick up the whole thing without being told that we're full and we can't carry anymore. That would be sort of the ideal situation, would be to get one in a haul and then scoot off somewhere and sell it. So performance aside, we got this main body of the ship taken care of. You can see we're just basically, again, filling in armor at this point. I could have tucked some more equipment in this opening. It was large enough that we could have probably put in something that would have been meaningful. But I decided, instead of doing that, to give myself some pretty robust armor along the top of the ship and reduce the likelihood that we're going to have problems with bad guys punching through the hull. And I mean, if you look at the engines, those engines are absolutely massive. Not so much the one that's in the middle, that square that you see in the middle of everything. It runs the full length of the ship pretty much, but obviously it's not very big on the other 2 axes. But the ones to either side are just titanic kinds of engines, and I don't want them getting blown up very easily, because as interesting as they may be to have these giant engines and all of the performance that they might bring, it's also a concern that if they get destroyed, you lose a big chunk of your performance, because that was a big engine you just lost. So we've got a certain amount of room that we can fill in with armor blocks. Still using, here's a little bit of a dilemma that I was thinking about. Given the size of the ship and the cost of the ship in terms of just the credits, much less the resources that we need to build it, I almost feel like building it out of titanium is kind of cheeky. Because by the time you have, I think, the ability to generate the kind of wealth that you would need in order to be able to build this ship, I don't think that you're going to be wanting to build it out of titanium. I think that there would be better things that you would want to build it out of, just to see, you know, what you can get between where you are now and where you are when you have enough resources to build a ship like that. I think we would probably end up with better materials and consequently a better ship overall. And it's not as easy as I originally thought to necessarily upgrade the components that you have, or not necessarily the components like the armor of the ship. I tried messing around with it and doing the upgrade, and it seems like it works really well. Upgrading each individual block based on the shape of the block if you don't have the proper shape of the block selected when you go to upgrade, it replaces whatever block you select with the block that you have highlighted. It's not necessarily, at least on the surface, it's not necessarily as useful as I thought it might be. There was a part of me that had hoped it would be one of those things where you could just select the entire ship and click a button and upgrade it to, or, you know, just at least transition it to a different material. So it's not going to work out that way, I don't think. But it was a thought that I had that, again, building this out of titanium, maybe not going to line up with the expectation one might have of a ship of this cost. This part here actually kind of surprised me when I started working on it. This is the back of the ship, and we're doing similar to what we did in the last episode, where we're just using pyramids and inside corner blocks to kind of taper the edges so that they start to slope down a little bit along the top and then kind of come to a finer point. If you were to continue tapering these, eventually they would all meet together at a point somewhere. So we start off, we do a slope at a certain length, and then the next row of blocks that we have in that transition, that whole sort of profile, is a little bit shorter but the same thickness. And that's how we get that curve effect, is by keeping you know, the thickness the same, but the length of the blocks that we're using shorter than the previous row. We get a curve instead of just a slope, and that's basically what we'll be doing for this back end. And the way that it worked out, I'm really happy with, just because it's got a really nice sort of transition from the curvy but nevertheless sort of uniform main hull. It's sort of straight in between all the curves, to something that just kind of goes very slowly, very gradually off the back end, and then we can fill it in and we can do some things with it to make it look a little bit more interesting. Very happy with the way that turns out, and you'll have a chance to see that before the video is done here today. So we have the central hull is basically buttoned up. We're working on the back end here. When we get to the front end, the main design consideration that I have in mind, just a little bit of foreshadowing, so to speak, is that I want something that can take the brunt of the punishment. If we find ourselves in a combat situation, I want the front of the ship to be the part of the ship that takes the beating, and make it very difficult to punch a hole through the front of the ship to anything significant in behind. And this is based on my experience with the Malapis, where anytime I got into a combat situation, just the nature of the beast, the front of the ship was the part of the ship that took the most beating. And in fact, I actually transitioned manually, block by block, all of the blocks on the front of the Malapis to the armored blocks, because I really felt like it was important to beef that up. So this time around, I want to go for the same kind of approach, but deliberately from the beginning, and have a really beefy sort of front end that can take a lot of punishment, even though I don't necessarily see this as being a particularly effective combat vessel, just because it's such a big friggin' target, especially from above or below. But we'll see. We'll see how it works out. I kind of expect, in order to be able to justify the builds that come after this one, that we're going to have to spend a certain amount of time in this ship, cruising around and doing the things that a person would do if they were doing something other than building a ship, in order to be able to say that we have a certain familiarity with what it, you know, involving what it takes to actually build one of these ships with materials you gathered on your own, as opposed to that approach of I'm building in creative. I'm using certain dev tools to kind of allow me to build in creative, unbothered by what's going on around me. But I don't necessarily want to be the kind of video producer who, or, you know, shipbuilder who presents these ships with no context in terms of how they're going to survive in a regular game environment, where you have to come up with the resources and you have to come up with the credits. And if, you know, the ship isn't any good, you can spend a lot of time and a lot of effort getting the crap kicked out of you while you're building the ship. And in the end, it wasn't really worth it because he spent a lot of time in a vulnerable position trying to get this thing done, and it wasn't very good. So there's got to be a balancing act, I think, and part of that will be using the ship that I just built and familiarizing myself with the process of being able to put myself in a position to build the next ship, and that's what we'll be doing. Here we've got the underside is basically the same as the top portion that we just finished. I thought about doing it a little bit different with a different profile on the underside of this central hull section as opposed to what we had on the top, but ultimately I decided that at this point I'm going to keep them the same, and then if we do anything different, it'll be the very tail end between the top and the bottom where we kind of fill everything in, and then we have a little bit of wiggle room where we can add things that aren't necessarily as useful as they were by extending them back. At this point in the build, we're giving a little bit of extra protection to the engines because you're not going to be able to hit them as easily from the sides of the ship. You basically, if you want the direct shot to the engines, will have to be coming from directly behind them based on what we've just built. Even better when we fill them in so that they're actually thick enough to make a difference. But the general idea is there's a certain amount of space where we can continue building back, and it adds a significant amount of additional protection strategically. But beyond a certain point, it's no longer that big of a deal. It's not going to make that much of a difference. And I wanted to make sure that whatever sort of cosmetic stuff we might do on the back end, just to make it look interesting, is beyond that threshold where we're not relying on those cosmetic things for any real significant amount of protection. They're just there for looks. So we're going to take a look at that when we do the overall sort of cosmetic detailing once the main hull is done and taken care of. So I think the next thing that I'm going to do is put a basic crew complement in the ship, get everything staffed up to where it needs to be at this point in the build, and then we can do some performance testing. We can kind of scoot around in it and see how it handles, how it spins and does all the things that it needs to do, the acceleration, the boosting, the braking, how that works relative to everything else, and also take it through an asteroid belt and see just how much of a factor the size of the ship is going to be in terms of our ability to get around without doing massive amounts of damage to the ship by colliding with asteroids in this big, wide, bulky sort of disaster in the making. I call it a disaster in the making, but I'm actually starting to grow quite fond of it. I like the design. I like the way it's coming together. I think for a ship of this size, it has the potential to be quite an interesting design, and only time will tell if it actually performs up to the appearance. So I'll leave you to watch this last little bit. Next episode, like I say, will be probably doing just a couple minutes showing off where it's at in terms of the performance based on what we've got in place, and then we're just going to continue on filling things in, kind of figure out what goals we need to have in terms of that performance, and then we'll also be looking at the front part of the ship, at least briefly, to get an idea of how we're going to get started there. So if you want to be notified about the next video, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.